To our incredible viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, tell us, which part of the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Now, onto today's tale. Chapter 1. Homecoming. The Georgia heat slammed into Blake Barnes the moment he stepped out of his air-conditioned truck. At 42, his lean build came from years in construction, not gyms. He wiped sweat from his forehead and looked over his property. The two-story farmhouse had belonged to his parents. After leaving the Marines, he'd spent 5 years restoring it. It wasn't grand, but it was his, a sanctuary after 12 years of deployments and the kind of memories that still jolted him awake at 3 a.m. His phone vibrated. Patty Rubio was calling. Blake, thank God. Patty's voice cracked with exhaustion. Did you get my messages? Just got back from the Hendricks job. What's up? It's Carlos. I need you to take him this summer. Patty had remarried 3 years earlier to Romero Rubio, a regional manager at a pharmaceutical firm. Blake had never liked Romero. There was something about that bright white smile and the way he dominated conversations. What about your trip to Europe? Romero's work. It's complicated. Please, Blake. Carlos needs time away from here. Things have been tense. Blake heard a tremor in her voice, an attempt to steady herself. Patty, what's happening? Please, 2 months. I'll explain when we get back. Blake glanced at the empty house and then at the workshop where he was restoring a 1967 Mustang. He'd been picturing a quiet summer, but Carlos was 13, and Blake remembered being that age, the year his father died, when everything changed. When are you bringing him? Tomorrow morning. Thank you, Blake. You don't know what this means. The line cut out before he could ask more. The next morning Romero pulled up in a black Mercedes. Carlos sat in the passenger seat looking small, eyes on his phone, thumbs moving. Blake noticed black leather gloves on the boy's hands, odd in June. Hey, kiddo, Blake said, opening the door. Carlos muttered something that might have been a greeting without looking up. Romero stayed in the car. We appreciate this, Blake. Carlos has been going through a phase, rebellious stuff. We thought time away from the city would help. Blake studied Romero through the window. Expensive cologne, a suit that stayed pristine despite the heat, but dark circles under his eyes and fingers tapping anxiously on the wheel. A phase, Blake repeated flatly. You know how kids are, too much internet, bad influences. Romero's smile never reached his eyes. Keep him busy. Physical work, discipline, that's what he needs. Your military background should help. The way Romero said it tightened Blake's jaw. I'm not running a boot camp. Of course not. Romero's tone implied he thought otherwise. Carlos, get your things. The boy moved like he was heading to an execution, hauling a duffel from the back seat and clearly struggling with it. When Blake reached to help, Carlos flinched. I got it, he muttered, gloves still on. Romero drove off wordlessly, leaving dust behind. Blake carried a box of Carlos's things, mostly books and a laptop, while the boy trudged up the porch. Allergic to something? Blake asked, nodding at the gloves. No. Then why? My hands are sensitive. Carlos's voice had that adolescent defensive edge. He added, the sun hurts them. Blake had seen enough in Fallujah and Kandahar to spot a lie, but he also knew when to wait. All right, I'll show you your room. The first week fell into a routine. Blake rose at dawn, cooked breakfast, eggs and toast or sometimes pancakes, and found Carlos already at the kitchen table with gloved hands around a mug of orange juice, staring off. The gloves never came off. Not at meals, not during chores, not even in 95 degrees heat while they worked in the garden Blake had started. When Blake suggested he might be more comfortable without them, Carlos always answered, my hands are sensitive. Blake didn't push, he observed. Carlos was quiet but not slow. He listened closely when Blake showed him the table saw, asked good questions, and when they worked on the Mustang's engine he showed a natural feel for mechanics. Yet a sadness pinned him down, a burden no 13-year-old should carry. At night Blake heard him crying through the bedroom wall. On the 8th day Blake called Patty. Voicemail. Romero's number. Voicemail too. He texted, everything okay? Carlos seems troubled. No reply. That evening Blake watched Carlos throw a tennis ball against the barn wall with mechanical precision, still wearing the gloves. The boy's form favored his left hand as if in pain. Blake's marine instincts. Trust your gut. screamed that the boy was in trouble. Chapter 2. The Bathroom Incident. Blake, always an early riser from his military days, padded down the hall at 5:47 a.m., planning a shower before breakfast. The bathroom door was ajar and water ran. He almost called out, almost announced himself, but something, instinct, that situational awareness that had kept him alive, made him move silently, stepping carefully on old floorboards he knew wouldn't creak. Through the gap he saw Carlos at the sink, back to the door. The gloves lay on the counter. The boy washed his hands with the precise focus of someone performing surgery. Blake's breath froze. Carlos's palms were a map of horror. Chemical burns, both healing and fresh, patches of raw red flesh and white scar tissue. Some burns were circular and precise, like hot metal pressed to skin. Others were irregular, like splashes. The pattern climbed his wrists and vanished under sleeves. The fresh wounds were dark and angry, only a few days old. Carlos reached for a tube of expensive prescription ointment and applied it with practiced efficiency. His face in the mirror looked blank, detached, as if he had to disconnect to survive. Blake felt his Marine training switch on. Assess, plan, act. But this wasn't combat with clear enemies. This was his nephew, hurt in ways Blake was only beginning to grasp. He slipped back to the kitchen and grabbed his phone. His hands trembled dialing Patty again, straight to voicemail. Romero too. Blake's mind ran through possibilities. This was abuse, certainly, but the burns were specific and methodical, not blind rage, something worse. He heard the bathroom door and steps. Carlos entered the kitchen with gloves back on, face neutral. "Morning," the boy said. "Sit down," Blake said, his voice harder than intended. Carlos froze. Fear flickered then was gone. "I didn't do anything. Sit down." The boy sank into a chair, bracing for a lecture, punishment, rejection, the look Blake had seen on Iraqi children who learned adults brought pain. Blake pulled out the opposite chair, forcing calm into his voice. "I saw your hands." Carlos went white. "I can explain. No lies. Not to me. Not anymore." Blake leaned forward. "Who's hurting you?" "Nobody's," Carlos whispered. Blake's voice could cut steel. "I spent 12 years in the Marines. I've seen chemical burns. Those on your hands. That's not sensitivity. That's not an accident. Someone is doing this to you, and I need to know who." The boy's composure cracked. He hiccuped and fought back tears with the learned desperation of someone who knew crying made things worse. "I can't," he whispered. "You don't understand. If I tell, he'll handle it." Blake's voice hardened. "I can't protect you if I don't know what we're facing." "You can't protect me," Carlos sobbed. "Nobody can." He said if I told anyone he'd hurt Mom. He said he has people everywhere. "And who said that?" Carlos shook, pleading, "Please don't make me. Just send me back. I'll be more careful. I won't mess up again." Blake crouched beside him, fighting the urge to force answers. "Look at me," he said. Carlos raised eyes that were Patty's, terrified and pleading. "I'm going to protect you," Blake promised, "and your mother, but you have to trust me." "Can you do that?" The boy nodded after a long silence. "Okay," Blake said. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." Chapter 3. The Truth Emerges. Carlos's story came out in broken, painful fragments while Blake made coffee and listened without interruption. It started 6 months earlier. Romero brought a business proposition for Carlos, a way to earn money and learn responsibility. Initially it was innocent, organizing Romero's home office, filing. Then Romero introduced Carlos to associates, names that turned Blake cold. Terrence Reyes, a chemist stripped of his license after a malpractice scandal. Perry Jefferson, who handled distribution, and Mel LeBlanc, the scary quiet one who was always present. They were making drugs. Not drugs, Blake interrupted, but Carlos struggled to explain. Romero called it pharmaceutical arbitrage. Getting chemicals through his company, Terrence synthesizing prescription meds people needed but couldn't afford. Romero painted it as helping people. He showed Carlos news about deaths from unaffordable insulin and heart meds, painted them as heroes. And the burns. Terrence needed help in the lab, Romero said. If you spill or mix chemicals wrong, he'd been using Carlos as child labor in an illegal drug lab. And when you got hurt? Blake asked. He acted worried. Took me to a private doctor and made me promise not to tell Mom. Said it was an accident and wouldn't happen again. Carlos's voice hollowed. The second time Mel was there. He told me if anyone found out, police, Mom, they'd all go to jail, including Mom, because the operation ran out of our house. Romero keeps the lab in a storage facility. Mom thinks he's working late. Carlos said Romero showed him pictures of people who'd tried to interfere. Blake paced, cataloging facts like he'd been trained. Romero wasn't just criminal. He manipulated and threatened a child, using Patty as leverage. Romero sent you away, Blake said. Carlos nodded. The last batch went wrong. I spilled a beaker of precursor chemical. It ate through my gloves and burned my hands. They were behind on production. Romero called me useless and a liability. He sent me away for the summer to think about responsibilities, cooperate or be cut off. The threat implied far worse than losing money. Blake pulled out his phone. I'm calling the police. Carlos lunged. Panic struck. You can't. He has contacts in the department. He told me he has cops on his payroll. If you call the wrong people, they'll warn him. Then Mom dies. Maybe us, too. The boy dissolved into tears, the teenager gone, the terrified child revealed. Please, Uncle Blake, forget it. I'll go back at summer's end. I'll be careful. Absolutely not, Blake said. You're not going back, but we'll handle Romero and his partners the right way. I need everything you know. Locations, schedules, names, how it works. Carlos wiped his eyes with gloved hands. Blake explained he wouldn't call local cops who might be dirty. He'd reach people he trusted, guys from his unit and contacts who could handle this properly. He mentioned Romero had made a mistake. What mistake? Carlos asked. Blake thought of the operators he'd served with and the skills he'd learned. Direct action, tactical planning, close quarters combat. He met Carlos's eyes. Your stepfather is used to scaring people and dealing with desperate folks. He's not used to someone who knows how to dismantle an operation and deal with threats head-on. He's about to learn the difference. Chapter 4. Building the Case. 3 days later Rebecca Ross arrived, driving an unremarkable sedan and wearing jeans and a Georgetown sweatshirt that made her look more like a grad student than an FBI special agent. Late 30s, sharp-eyed, quietly confident from years taking down complex criminals, she met Blake at a diner 20 minutes from his property, Carlos in tow. The boy had been jittery all morning, convinced any law enforcement contact would alert Romero. Your hands, Rebecca said right after introductions. Carlos looked at Blake. Blake nodded. Slowly the boy removed his gloves. Rebecca's face remained composed, but Blake saw her pupils dilate, the only sign of reaction. She took out her phone and began methodically photographing them. How many inci